I'm really excited to having Dr. Matt Zakreski, a psychologist, and is the founder of the Neurodiversity Collective. So glad to have you to the podcast and welcome to the
Thanks
show.
for having me. I'm lucky enough to do a lot of podcasts, but this is definitely the first one of these I've done. So when you reached out to me, I said, "Oh, how cool is that?" I had to quickly rabbit hole and listen to as many of your episodes as I could. I feel like I'm relatively caught up.
All right, there's a few episodes, and so glad I do a lot of podcast listening myself and trying to learn and expand and trying to help learn more about neurodiversity and the intersection with a lot of people with also some struggles. There's a lot of so many gifts that go along with it, but also many struggles and often related to being misunderstood and many other aspects to that. But
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you think about the word misunderstood, right? There's been this groundswell of information and advocacy around neurodivergence over the last 10 years, right? There have been people who've been ringing these gongs for decades. We've hit that critical mass over the last decade. And it really is lovely to see it coming. But there's a lot of people who are playing catch up right now, saying these are terms and words and paradigms I've got to get behind if I'm going to do my job as a medical doctor, as a psychologist, as a psychiatrist, as a teacher, as a coach. What do I need to know? So it really is an honor to be able to speak to more the medical side of these things. And I know that psychology and medicine have at times crossed swords in their history, but I've always seen it that we're all on the same team. And I genuinely cannot do my job without you. I need someone to weigh in on the medical side and help with the internal pieces of it. And I will do my part to inform what care and environments should look like for people with different brains.
yeah, great. Can you give a little broader background on who you are and when it comes to your
Yeah.
training?
So I'm Dr. Matt Zakreski. Everybody calls me Dr. Matt. I am a twice exceptional individual. So I was identified gifted in second grade and diagnosed with ADHD in high school. It explained a lot. So that was good. So this work is personal and professional for me. I graduated with my PsyD in 2016 and really with a focus on helping gifted and other neurodivergent kids. So a lot of my training in grad school were placements around that population. And I've been lucky enough to work in schools that support these kids and consult with schools and give talks all over the world. It's often the community that people don't know is out there, and being neurodivergent can feel very isolating. You feel very alone, right? Like oftentimes I feel like my job is more of a clearinghouse. It's like, hey, you're gifted in Iowa. Did you know that Iowa has one of the best state organizations for giftedness, as well as the Bell and Blanc Center at the University of Iowa in Iowa City? And they stare at me like, wait, what? I'm not the only one. I'm like, no, there's a lot of you. So go Hawkeyes if you're an Iowan. And then we get into the psychoeducation and the therapy and the advocacy piece. But a lot of it's just, hey, welcome to the club. We're happy to have you.
Awesome. When you have a special history with yourself and then wanting to help and seeing a big
Yeah.
need for so many different ways, like we talked about in the beginning, kind of misunderstood. And there's so many different things to talk about, but one of the things that intersects with many people who struggle with chronic pain disorders are often a mismatch in environment and with a calibration of how their brain and nervous system works. And there are many people we're finding that who are on the neurodivergent spectrum who also struggle with these chronic centralized pain disorders we call fibromyalgia, migraines, IBS, a lot of those that overlap. And one of the topics that I'd like to ask you about is understanding
Yeah.
trauma and that as it connects with people who have neurodivergent brains, as it seems that often they are more likely to have gone through high stress, trauma type situations. But so can you generally talk just what are the different types of trauma that somebody might have to go through?
So trauma is as wide of a concept as basically the human experience is. And the single most important differentiator when it comes to trauma is the perception of threat. This is an example from my own life. So I was in New Zealand once and we were whitewater rafting, and I got knocked out of the boat in front of the biggest rapid on the river, a class 4 rapid. I was underwater for more than 2 minutes. And I remember distinctly thinking, I'm going to die. And you're wearing a life vest, right? But the current was so strong, my helmet was above the water. So I'm going to die with what, 8 inches, right? Away from air. It was comical almost. And then I hit a rock and I bounced out of the water and swam like mad to my friend's boat, right? And I perceived that as very scary, but oh my gosh, I'm lucky to be alive. And let's just move along with our lives, right? That was the thing that happened. And on the spectrum of things that happened, that sucked. And then as we are leaving the river, one of the other people on our boat tour scraped her knuckles on a rock. And she called her father, who called the attorney. And for the rest of our vacation, another 6 days, she would not shut up about scraping her fingers on that rock. The perception of that pain and the injury to self, right, is what drives the experience of trauma. And trauma is itself a discrete thing, right? It can be something very concrete and acute, like I was in a car wreck. It can be something environmental, like a building collapse. It can be something perceived, like I think my family's out of money, right? I think we're going to be poor. And all of those things can feed into trauma, right? Where we move from trauma to something like PTSD is when the symptoms, the psychological aftershocks of that event don't resolve within 6 months. You might be in a terrible car wreck and have nightmares about it for a couple of weeks. And then every so often, you know, twinge in your shoulder. But a couple of months later, things have more or less returned to normal. But in the trauma world, every time you hear a car screech, your brain snaps you back to when you got T-boned by that semi on Route 6. And our brains are, for better or for worse, great at yanking us back to that thing because it's a whole body experience when it comes to trauma.
And it seems that for many people who have fibromyalgia as their diagnosis, it's often preceded by, and I like using maybe a clinical term, high stress situation, because that can encompass a lot of different things and it allows all the different elements. And it's also that perception, as you said, one's high stress situation may not be another. It's interesting as reading some of the literature that you're probably, and I was reading some of this in preparation for this, is this measure of resiliency. And I think there's psychological tests of that. And I think many people who are listening and the people who I hope listen to this are people who are going or living with fibromyalgia, but also their loved ones and also the medical community who doesn't have a lot of training on this, but is looking to learn more. But I think for those who are struggling with this, the idea of resiliency may come across as a double entendre, that if you are not resilient, then you don't have a strength of fortitude in yourself, in your character, because we often attribute that as a positive thing. So any thoughts on that?
I often think my number one job as a therapist is to create an environment that fosters resiliency and help turn up the volume on a person's internal resiliency. I see that you wear glasses, right? You ever have that moment where you wish you were wearing your glasses so you could find your glasses, right? Resiliency can be very similar, right? I need to have resiliency to build resiliency, right? How do I build resiliency if I'm not resilient? But the fact of the matter is that if you are standing and drawing breath, you are being resilient. You're just feeling like the resilience you have isn't enough to meet the challenges you're being set with, right? It's if you can swim, but you can't swim in a big rip current, you might think you're a bad swimmer. No, it's just how many people on earth can swim through a strong rip current. So what we need to do is reframe it not as an all or nothing thing. I'm either resilient or I'm not. It's I can have more resilience. I always want to build my resilience. I want more and more of it so I can meet these challenges, because life is never going to stop giving us challenges. They're not all traumatic, but they are all challenges.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that support system is really
Yes.
important, and fostering that. I have a medical student doing rotations now, just first year, and getting a chance to observe, take a simple chief complaint, history of present illness, and just getting a chance to meet with a couple patients. And you have one person, and I asked, who's a second visit with me, who has some neurodivergency as part of some of these coexisting chronic pain type issues. And I asked, what is going on at home? I don't know you real well, but if you have a spouse or long-term boyfriend that is not using, doesn't have a substance use disorder, who has a consistency in how they treat you. And I just said, is that the case? And she laughed, of course it is. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, there's nothing, of
Right.
course. And we go into the next patient, and that's not the
Yeah.
case. And yet having that structure is often a challenge. And that's where that gets to be a really sticky situation. Going back to the trauma, I've heard of trauma being something that I don't want to say is you invited versus something that's random. Potentially the idea of a random act in war that just happens to happen on somebody, randomly hit by a car that you were not doing anything inappropriate, versus something that you may have had a partial contribution to.
And the role of the brain in this is so important. And it's also incredibly subjective, right? So I'm going to try and it's going to sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth here. Let's say you find yourself in a situation where you sneak out of the house at night to go to a concert. And while you're at the concert, a fist fight breaks out and you watch somebody get socked in the jaw and they collapse, right? That is a traumatic thing. You watched an assault occur and you find yourself replaying that over and over in your brain through this narrative. If I hadn't snuck out and gone to this concert, I wouldn't have been there. I wouldn't have seen this thing, right? And that is our brain telling the narrative. The really interesting thing about our brains is our brains seek to understand, and our brains will actually center ourselves in stories to help us understand it, even if the story is not our story. So our brain would rather have a navigable narrative that makes sense to them, even if it's wrong, than acknowledge that the universe is full of entropy. Like that random car wreck. If I hadn't stopped and gotten ice cream, I would have been in the intersection at that time. But you wouldn't have been, or maybe you would have. I don't know. But this is what our brains do. I was a senior in high school during 9/11, and I'm from New Jersey. So, like my town, you can look up and see the Manhattan skyline from my town, and talk traumatic event, right? Not only locally, nationally, maybe globally traumatic. And I cannot tell you how many of my peers in high school were like, it's my fault my mom went to work in Manhattan today. And your mom has gone to work every day in Manhattan since you were 3, right? You're 18 now. And like, why would that be any different today? But this is what our brains do. Our brains are like, I would rather be the main character and to understand something than try and make sense of the universe is this cold, unfeeling random place. And it's, you might see this at home with your partner or partners, right? You come home, your partner's in a bad mood. You're like, hey, what's wrong? Nothing. Oh, but something's wrong. Nothing. I don't want to talk about it. And you start going, what did I do? I clearly did something. What did I do? And you ask your partner that enough till they're finally mad at you. And your brain at some level goes, this I can handle. I know what this one is. And for all of us that are partnered, we're all like nodding vigorously at our headsets as we listen to this in the car. But that doesn't make it true. Your partner could have had a bad day at work, or stubbed their toe, or gotten a really sad phone call from their great aunt, or a million other things, right?
Trying to help understand what's going on. I think that idea of locus of
Mhm.
control is our natural tendency is to look inside and what our role is, but also that's often where it isn't in our control, and having to look outward. And that's especially when a trauma happens, that's a very challenging to navigate through that. When we look at what types of trauma seem to have the biggest impact on people.
So the types of trauma that seem to have the greatest impact are twofold. The first is immediate threat of grievous injury or loss of autonomy, right? If you were sexually assaulted, that is a grievous threat to body and autonomy, right? That is, and there's way too much sexual assault out there. That could be its own podcast, of course. But if that's something that happens to you, and we know that many people have suffered sexual assault, not all of them develop trauma or PTSD as a result of it, but many do because of the intensity of that. The other thing that seems to lead to the most trauma is environmental chronic trauma. Like chronic food insecurity, for instance, is a trauma, right? And you can have a trauma response to that. My grandfather, when he was still alive, who lived through the Great Depression, right? He was a child during that, and he was a very psychologically sound person who also collected everything to the point where his house was almost a hoarder house. The man never played a round of golf in his life, and he owned over 100 sets of golf clubs because he grew up in several years of scarcity of food, scarcity of objects, scarcity. I don't think you could isolate a singular event in there that was capital T traumatic, right? But there's something to be said about the longitudinal nature of a bad situation you can't get out of. And I think what you and I are seeing in our professions is the resultant traumatic effects of COVID. If you zoom out for a second, right? We lived through a situation where on Friday, it was a normal day. On Saturday, the world was shut down by an invisible illness that we couldn't see and didn't understand and killed millions of Americans and millions of people worldwide. Talk about trauma. If it was a wolf in the neighborhood, you could see the wolf, you could fight the wolf. Do I touch things? Do I not touch things? Do I hug people? Do I put a mask on? Like, how do I navigate this thing? And it's terrifying. If you have, even for your own bodily self, family, I have young children. My son was born during COVID. It's like, how do I go to the grocery store and buy food for my family if I am risking bringing home a deadly pathogen that could kill my son? And we had to make those psychological choices every day with no run up. It's like, in many ways, it's amazing society didn't collapse. But that's the resilience of the human spirit, is that I don't know how many people would describe themselves as handling COVID with resilience. But as a mental health professional, I can say the vast majority of us did. That's amazing.
And what we're finding too, for many people who were infected with the virus, most don't have long-term symptoms, but there are those that have that acute inflammatory response. The inflammation goes away, but there are persistent symptoms, similar like getting in a car accident. Your bones have healed, the muscle swelling is healed, yet you have persistent symptoms. What does the research say of the effect on the brain of these high stress trauma events?
So high stress trauma events release a tremendous amount of cortisol in our bodies, right? And too much cortisol over time is very toxic. It wears our systems down. The good news is that, so the brain is plastic in the sense that it responds to repeated stressors and pain, but the brain will also respond to repeated safety and cure. We call this epigenetics, right? The body responds to its environment and the environment responds to the body. So if you're out there and you're like, yeah, I was a kid who grew up in poverty, food scarcity, I slept in my car multiple times, and sometimes I didn't know who I was coming home to. Those things potentially were traumatic for you. And you might be sitting there. So Dr. Matt's telling me that, oh, great, this is my destiny. No, what happens to our brains and bodies are not destiny. It is a thing. It is a chapter in a book. We can't pretend it didn't happen. And I think a lot of people get into trouble trying to pretend that they didn't get into that car accident, or they didn't survive that sexual assault, or they didn't worry all day if their uncle had made it out of 9/11, right? Like those are things that happen. They're part of our stories, but there's more book to be written. And as you start to see that event in the broader context of a story, of a life narrative, you build more space and context around that event, which gives your brain somewhere else to anchor and reflect on that, which is really, it's one of the most amazing things about our brains is our brains will actively respond and change our bodies to situations of threat and to situations of peace. And that's how we use that information to amplify the work that mental health professionals do.
So a hypothetical patient out there who may be going through a story like this, who has gone through trauma, maybe has been through high stress in middle school, may have been the victim of successive sexual assaults or taken advantage of in many ways by people that some of it's been
Yeah.
forgotten for obvious reasons in the brain, but now is still having these ongoing struggles. And a patient might ask me, is there any hope? How do I get through this? And maybe in a higher stress situation as well, meaning some economic insecurity, some social insecurity, maybe their car is no longer working, having to take the bus. The question has been asked to me, how do I get through this? Is there any hope or am I doomed? And this may be somebody who recognizes that they have a neurodivergent brain on top of this. What would you, if you got a chance to meet with somebody, how might you help them work through something like that?
And I think what we're looking at here is the depth of challenge, right? Mental health challenges are not just, oh, I'm depressed, right? It manifests in relationships and self-esteem and occupation and education and transportation and housing and food. And if you're neurodivergent, the world is not built for you. The world is not built for people who are autistic or dyslexic or ADHD. Schools are not built for gifted kids. We built society to meet the most people, and most people are neurotypical, right? Most people have regular-ish brains and that can navigate within those basic parameters, right? But those of us who are in the neurodivergent community, what we see is that because our brains are different, that all flows downhill. So whereas, oh gosh, Johnny, you lost your job and you're worried your car's going to be repossessed, go just get another job. And Johnny's, I've got significant sensory needs. I can't be on my feet for very long. I don't really get along with people terribly well. The job at the call center was perfect because I didn't have to talk to anybody in person and I had a nice comfortable chair, but I got laid off. And now I'm not somebody who can go work at Burger King. That's not a thing I can do. So your divergences that will make you an absolute rock star at the right job or the right school or with the right partner. Unfortunately, those things are harder to find when you're neurodivergent, especially if you're operating from a deficit in knowledge, right? If you just think you're a little quirky and you don't know you have an IQ of 145 and you're profoundly gifted and you're like, why does the world not make sense? Knowledge is power, right? We've got to inform you about your brain, the pieces of that brain and how they manifest in the real world. So then we can work smarter to meet some of those environmental systemic needs. My favorite kind of therapy is a big hug, a grilled cheese sandwich, and $50,000. Unfortunately, I can never do that kind of therapy because I don't have $50,000, let alone $50,000 times all the people I see. Right. But that would be the best therapy, right? $50,000 in a grilled cheese sandwich for everybody. That'd be great. So what we need to do is think outside the box, because there are things in life that are therapeutic that are not therapy. To bridge our professions again, right? Apple a day keeps the doctor away. An apple doesn't make you magically healthy. It's not like the one apple I ate in college. I was like, that undoes all the fried food. Just that singular apple I ate that time. But it is emblematic of a commitment to healthier choices, right? And so that's something that's therapeutic without being therapy. So things like exercising, moving your body are therapeutic. It's not therapy. Listening to music, having a home cooked meal, comfort with another human that you can trust, animals, those are all things that are therapeutic. And that's why in the UK, they're piloting this program where medical and psychological professionals can prescribe music. They can prescribe pets because it's like, hey, you might not be somebody who can handle financially, psychologically, logistically, whatever, to do 8 months of intense psychotherapy. But you're damn right that you can go to the coffee shop that has the stray kittens in it and sit there and have a mocha and pet some cats. And that's going to release a lot of dopamine in your brain. You're taking care of yourself. You're being intentional about it. And that starts to rewire some of the bad stuff that happens from trauma. It's the sort of thing like, so often my work isn't, here's how we're going to unpack this bad thing that happened to you. So often it's the thing is like, what can you do right now to take care of yourself? And it's, sometimes it's like, feel like, oh, I was going to make myself a cup of tea before therapy. I ran out of time. And I'm like, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go make that cup of tea right now. I can wait 2 minutes. So then I just sit there, my therapist fingers. Yeah, it's interesting. Very good. And then they have their tea. And I'm like, did that feel good? They're like, it did. Because that's the thing. Doing a good thing for yourself with intention, you get extra credit for it in your brain. An extra dose of dopamine. That's a wonderful thing.
Awesome. It sounds a little bit like nutrition advice, like you said, mentioning the apple, but also you can focus on, often I'd say it's better to think about adding something than subtracting. And sometimes you can't, the locus of control being that there are things that I have found that help turn down the intensity. And I'm thinking is somebody who's going through that may be, okay, one of the things that if you have a autistic style brain is I do have to do basic routines and I do better with that. Go to bed at a consistent time, have a wind down consistently, have that consistent daytime, have a healthy routine. Maybe there involves music or drawing, even if you can't afford the paints. Maybe there's crayons, maybe there's simple methods that you can do. Maybe it's simple dancing a little bit if you are into music that can be in your own living room, and maybe doing that together with somebody and having within whatever your means are, which is a very frustrating problem because in medicine, many people are expecting that quick fix, miracle, pure medical model of helping somebody quickly get better. When we look at people who have neurodivergent style brains, nervous systems, etc., are they more susceptible in one sense to sustained effects of trauma?
So the research on this is very interesting because I also did my homework. So intelligence is a significantly protective factor vis-a-vis resilience factors for trauma. So the more intelligent you are, that is somehow a protective factor, right? And we could talk about some of the systemic stuff there, but it's a little bit too wishy-washy. But giftedness is more than just intelligence. It is a complete different neurotype, right? So if we think about the parietal lobe on top of our head, our sensory center, that the feedback that comes from that center goes through our entire body through the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So if you are someone whose brain is more susceptible to taking in sensory input, that parietal lobe is hypercharged. It's going to do more stuff. Those neural connections from the parietal lobe to the rest of your brain, they're not local roads, guys. They're superhighways. So those impulses they're flying down into that sympathetic nervous system. You're having a big response to it. The bigger the response, the more likely it is to read as traumatic. And I do this exercise when I give talks, and it's just, we'll do a version of it now. So I have here in my hand this invisible porcelain bowl. Right there is the invisible porcelain bowl. I'm holding it. And now look, I have this metal fork in my other hand. Now, if you're not watching the video of this, I'm not holding a bowl, nor am I holding a fork, but I am painting a mental picture. And I'm going to take my fork and put it inside the porcelain bowl and go, great. And I guarantee you, of your many listeners, a lot of them are cringing right now. Not because anything is actually happening, but because our brains are perceiving that. Their brains are going, when that thing happens, it hurts. I don't like that thing. I don't want it to happen. So your body is having a whole response to that. And the seminal work on trauma is the body keeps the score, right? Because trauma is not just a brain thing. It's not just a heart thing. It's a whole body thing, which is why you have those images of veterans hearing a car backfire and doing a barrel roll behind a bench and creating an imaginary machine gun. Because the event isn't just happening up here. Your brain is sending signals to your body. I'm in a life or death situation. Use the training. Go back to when you were 19 and shipped out to Iwo Jima, right? That's what you're going to do. And for all intents and purposes, for your brain's sake, you're back there on that island. You might be in small town Minnesota, but you're actually, psychologically speaking, you're back there on that island. So when we treat trauma, we have to heal the body, not just the mind. And that's what makes this work so challenging, because we're fighting an entire nervous system, not just a rogue circuit of brain that makes you say, I don't like myself very much, which is its own very thorny problem, of course.
Sounds like people who have neurodivergent brains tend to have a more
Mhm.
susceptibility to stress and just how their brain is wired. When I think of in childhood, and I often take part of the history as I find, and I don't know if what your experience has been with this, that they're more likely to have been victims of being bullied as in childhood. I know you do a lot of work with kids. Is that something that has any validity to that, or is that
Oh,
just
absolutely. Like we said before, the world is not built for neurodivergent types, right? As much as America is an individualistic society where we celebrate individual greatness, it doesn't work that way in school, right? If you standing out in something can be dangerous, it can be life threatening. If you're the one kid who's in your town and you have rainbow hair, you are identifying yourself in a way that is awesome and brave and wonderful, but also can elicit significant bullying because the system is, you are not like us. And my kids that I work with who are brilliant kids, sometimes smarter than their teachers, will hear stuff like from adults, if you're so smart, how come you can't? Or I thought you were some sort of genius if the kid gets something wrong, because there is an ill fit in the environment. And this is why people develop the masking, the idea of I'm going to pass right to go. And I'm a neurodivergent adult. I was just at an event at my kid's school this evening and I did fine. Nobody would have guessed that I have a 144 IQ and I have ADHD because I've gotten very good at pretending to be like them. But there's a cost to that. And it's nice to actually come on this podcast and be my sort of authentic, all over the place neurospicy self, because this is not masking. This is just, hey, this is Dr. Matt. So, we need to have spaces where you can drop the neurotypical act and be neurodivergent. And sometimes that's like the kids got to go to public school because we can't put them somewhere else, but they can go to the chess club at the library that meets at 3:30. And they go there and it's like at the end of the day when you take your bra off or your tie off, it's like, yeah, and yes, good. And it's not unlike that, right? So many kids I know who do the arts, right? They're dancers, they're singers, they're theater kids. They're like, I look forward to that all day. The worst day at theater rehearsal is better than the best day in gym class, right? Because that is not, right? Because that's a place where they can be atypical, right? And everybody needs a space to be themselves. Everybody needs a space to let their hair down. But the more hair you have to let down, to further the metaphor, right, the more important those spaces become. So this is why you see a lot of neurodivergent people find online communities, do a lot of video games, do a lot of audiobooks and podcasts, because those are spaces they can create. They become bespoke, right? So many of my kids are on Discord because it's like, this is a Discord server for people who really One Piece but don't like the live action remake. That's the Discord we're in, right? This is the Discord for people who are accepted to Yale, but don't know how they got into Yale. That's a Discord that exists, right? So you can hyper specialize, which is amazing because when we were kids, the internet was in its gestational period, right? We didn't have those sort of things. So the idea of putting out a virtual flag and saying to all the other weirdos, here I am, and they can go, cool, there you are. It's, to make a very nerdy reference, it's like Lord of the Rings, like the beacons are lit, Gondor calls for it. And if you got that reference, you might be neurodivergent, right? If you know what page in the original Tolkien that was on, you are definitely a gifted kid, right? Welcome to the club. We meet on Tuesdays. It's going to be great. And that's the thing. That's the power of community, because making that reference connects me to people. And whether you listen to this podcast tomorrow or 2 years from now, you and I are having a moment that transcends time and space, because it's like, this nerdy psychologist said this thing and I went, that thing. And now we're bonded. And now we want more of that. We want more of those people, want more of those experiences, because psychologically it is about as healthy as you can get.
And adding to some of that, listening to patients' stories, which is really how you learn so much and how you've learned and expanded your understanding over the years. And I think of somebody who is trying to navigate the social complexities that a neurotypical brain takes completely for granted, and how that can be very complicated. And when you are different in a just communication, social interpretation of what's going on in an event, and then a neurotypical group will unfortunately attack that person for just being different. And that can be bullying on a childhood, on a playground, and they may not be as, it's more dyspraxia, not as coordinated, and have quirky and don't interact socially, and maybe then preyed on because they don't know how to do the dynamics. I had a patient of mine who, and this often happens in what I'm recognizing with a lot of these neurodivergences, where a patient who actually was been seen for some chronic centralized pain, and just in a visit was saying my son was diagnosed in middle school. And I said, honey, this came from me. This is how my brain works. He already has a history of ADHD, but also on that more autistic spectrum. And he has trauma going back to childhood, when a older high school age teenager said, when he was like 8 and sister was like 6 or something, let's play a game of show and tell. And it was take off your clothes. And to this day, I feel terrible that I didn't do something about it. Now, when you think about that, is to understand the social complexity that's a completely inappropriate thing, but not knowing how to navigate that may be more challenging for somebody who is more black and white in thinking and doesn't understand. I'm thinking of that as an example where maybe they are more prone to having, unfortunately, not that anybody invites that, but sadly somebody almost senses that vulnerability and sadly takes it.
Lions don't attack the healthy antelope. They attack the weird ones, the fringy bits. It's in a jungle, difference can be weakness. And it's funny because one of my many jobs is I'm a sex educator. And a lot of what I do is I put it through the lens of developing social and emotional skills. Like, obviously, hopefully in a positive way, that if like I'm attracted to you and you're attracted to me and we would like to do stuff together, we can communicate about that in a healthy, productive, pro-social way. Affirmative consent, it's a wonderful thing, right? But also, and this is why good sex education starts in kindergarten, is we're giving kids the explicit instructions on, if someone is making you or your body feel unsafe, here's what you do about that. And in the most recent research from this, 58% of kids said they didn't know who to contact in the case of a sexual assault. 58% of kids. That, as a mental health professional, And as a human, that breaks my heart. It breaks my heart every day. And that's one of the reasons I've taken this on as a part of what I do. But to take this back to the idea of trauma, right? Blaming yourself for being sexually molested or assaulted is like a nose blaming itself for smelling a fart. It's not the nose's problem, right? The thing existed and happened, and you were there and had to experience it, right? It's not any one person's problem except for the perpetrator of said trauma, right? And this is why empowering people, this is why we use the word survivor, not victim, right? I survived this thing that happened to me rather than, oh, I'm a victim. A victim is, it's like an end of a sentence. A survivor is a semicolon. Let's go. Where's the rest of the story going? And, so someone who navigates a situation like that, this show and tell thing, it makes them a survivor. It makes them not a victim. And it's so important that we understand that in mental health, for everything that it is, right? For mental health, it's the ability to hold multiple thoughts in your head at the same time. So if the narrative in your head is that I should have said something, I should have done something, I wish that I had handled it differently, those are real thoughts, and we cannot pretend that you're not having them. And we cannot pretend those thoughts are not valid in the sense that your brain is telling you that story. But what can also be true is that it is not appropriate to ask an 8-year-old to navigate that situation. An 8-year-old should never be put in that situation, right? And that's why we describe people like that as predators. No one asks to be prey, right? Nobody would take on that role in the great circle of life. So it's this idea of, and I get very passionate about this because, once again, that thing, main character energy, it's my fault, I'm going to center myself in the narrative. It's easy to blame yourself for 9/11. If I had done a better job in the Iraq War in 92, this would have never happened. And do you have any idea how many billions of other things had to happen to get from the Iraq War to 9/11? Literally billions of things. Do you know how many billions of things had to happen for you to recover from this thing, for this thing to happen or not happen? To place yourself in the center of that is psychologically understandable. It's also not defensible, right? It's not my fault my Giants are 1-1. It's not my fault Saquon Barkley's ankle is sprained. It's easy to blame myself. I didn't wear my lucky socks, damn it. So if you're out there and you're reliving your own trauma, the first thing, take care of yourself. First thing, anchor yourself to the earth, right? You are here and you are safe. The second thing is, I hope you hear us when we say what's happening to you is a whole body thing. It is the bridge of medicine and psychology, because it is really a whole body experience. Your body can heal when you find the right environments that will support that healing. So what happened to you is bad. It is also not a life sentence.
And when you're looking at trying to get help getting through this, what role, and I wrestle with this as I've been thinking more deeper about neurodivergency, especially autistic style brains and all of that, is the word diagnosis and labeling and the balance of that. But how important is recognition of this if somebody does have this neurodivergent type brain, especially when there's more interoception as you get into middle school and older, into adulthood, this awareness that this is a real entity that not only you and other people have. How important is that? What role does that play?
So diagnosis is helpful because it puts a name to a thing and can connect you to a community and can connect you to service, right? One of the things that I often tell people who are gifted is that you are likely to have stimming behaviors. Stimming behaviors are self-soothing, they're self-regulatory, right? For my entire life, I do this. I rub my hands together. And I've always thought it's because I had poor circulation and my hands were cold. My hands aren't cold. That's my wife. My hands are like ovens, right? I realize this is a stim. I do this when I'm overwhelmed. When I'm overstimulated, this is a way to regulate myself. even in that small moment. All of a sudden, that's a thing that fits under the neurodivergent umbrella and it locks in. Growing up as a gifted kid, I understood the intelligence part of it, the school part of it. When I was doing my research for my dissertation, I started reeling the developmental pieces, the asynchrony that comes with being neurodivergent and you can be chronologically 10 and have the intelligence of a 17-year-old with the social skills of an 8-year-old. And I was like, I always felt that way. I always felt like I logically understood what everybody was doing, but I didn't feel like I had the skills that everybody else, like they all had gone to some meeting and I missed that day. Like, how do they know how to go to parties? I would like to go to a party. Is that a thing? Is there an assembly? But it's because their brains are wired to hit those social rhythms in a way that my brain is not wired to do, or at least not for long periods of time. The understanding one's neurodivergence understands the whole piece of your brain and body, which means you're going to be more educated and more able to say, here are the things I need because of my brain. I'm going to do my best to put myself in situations that play to those strengths rather than continue to be in environments and with people who don't support those strengths or even play to my weaknesses. I am a pretty successful professional. You also don't want me being the treasurer of your organization. I will lose the money. I will not keep track of it. It will be in a mattress somewhere, and then we'll get audited by the state. I'm like, how are we $703 short? I didn't steal it. I didn't spend it. I just don't know where it is. Don't make me the treasurer of your organization, but you damn well better believe that if you need a speaker for your event that needs to raise that money, then I will come to where you are and I will do a damn good job because that's what I'm good at. I've built my practice, my professional identity around my strengths. And it took me the better part of 40 years to get there to a place where it's like, oh, wow, this is what I'm best at. And this is a crazy idea. I should do more of that. So give yourself permission through a diagnosis, through self-reflection, to understand yourself and put yourself in positions to succeed. You don't owe anybody the experience of you being miserable because that's what you feel like that's all you deserve or that feels like all you can do. I guarantee you there's a place out there and a job out there and a partner out there that will honor and accentuate those things rather than minimize them or ignore them.
And speaking of that diagnosis, it is seemingly difficult to find somebody who has experience. I think it's a challenge in the world of pediatrics. I think it's exponentially harder in the world of adults. Can you speak to that?
And this is one of the ways that the internet is a wonderful thing because there are lots of lists of providers out there who are neurodivergent affirming, right? Many of whom are autistic or ADHD or dyslexic or gifted themselves, myself included, right? I center neurodivergence in what I do because that's who I am. And I think the reason I can connect with kids is that I can say, listen, I know what it's like to be 8 and be smarter than your teacher. Here's how you live through that situation. And kids go, wait, what? Are we allowed to say that? I'm like, yeah, you are. In this space, you are. And if you don't know that person, if there's not one in your community, you shoot me an email and I will help you find that person because we are out there. There are not enough of us, but we're out there. And I can speak for the vast majority of my colleagues when I say that we are always happy to talk to your boss, HR department, the medical system, the legal system, the educational system. So more people know about what these brains are, what these brains do, and how these brains can be best served. Because then what we're doing is we're living in a world of equity. Everybody gets what they need. And that is, I think, foundational to best practice.
Is autistic training to help work with people of autism, is that a niche or is that a standard part of someone's training in the world of psychology? Or is that something as a special interest that somebody grooms because of their own interests, often maybe for themselves or a family member or just an interest because they find it very intriguing?
It's a lot of the latter. And what we're seeing is, so my very first job in mental health was I worked for a clinic that used ABA, or applied behavioral analysis. And that was for many years the gold standard of treating autistic people. And now we know it's ableist, it's not best practice. Now, there are lots of providers out there that use ABA appropriately, but the idea is that people within the autistic community say, like, ABA is about shaping my behavior to be neurotypical, and I can never be neurotypical. Wouldn't it be better to help me understand that this is a stim? So if I'm feeling anxious, let me stim and then get back to work, rather than training that stim out of me, which is a thing that may never work actually. Now, it's so hard in mental health to make any sweeping declarative statements, so I'm not going to do that because I'd rather not get sued. But the idea here is what we're seeing is more and more providers be neurodivergent affirming and not say, I've got to cure you, I've got to fix you. I have this conversation with it's almost always dads, actually. They've got a neurodivergent kiddo. Let's say you've got an autistic high schooler, and dad's, I was a wrestler. I was very good at wrestling. Wrestling taught me teamwork and sportsmanship and resilience, and I got super fit. And I think my son should do that. And I'm like, that's awesome. What a great idea. I'm so happy wrestling was helpful for you. Your kid with significant sensory needs and social anxiety will never be a wrestler. It's not a thing that they're going to do unless that kid turns around and says, yeah, Dr. Matt, I want to wrestle. Then I'll help them wrestle. But it starts with a kid's interest. The best way to be neurodivergent affirming is to say, what are your goals and how can I help you get there? There's no reason you cannot be an autistic actor or an ADHD accountant or a gifted florist. But the idea is, I got to know where you want to go, and I will do everything in my power to help you get there. It's about putting on the clothes you want to wear rather than me fitting you for a suit because that's what I think you should wear. Right. So that's what providers are starting to do. And the more of us do that, the more of us see the power of that. So it becomes this sort of groundswell of change.
I was on a golf course and random single golfer myself, 3 people I didn't know, very good golfers. Third last hole finishes up, and this person gave me some golf tips that I needed. I asked about family and had adopted. Their last child was adopted, who was on the spectrum and was having a lot of struggles. And I mentioned I have a special interest I mentioned that generically earlier, that I take care of people who have challenges, but I didn't explain what that was, just casually. I'm a pediatrician internist. And felt in emailed, shared, said that I'll be interviewing you and also on the upcoming podcast. And the question, and had started listening to one of the things on trust and having the importance of trust in the parent autistic child relationship, or in general partner relationship, and said, what I take away from this is a question: will my daughter ever trust me completely? I have to assume and remind myself the answer is most likely no. Doesn't mean I will stop trying, but it is most likely the reality. Thanks again. And I think that somebody who, I think, 18, 16 years of parenting since the adoption, and I don't know all the details, but there's been a lot of struggles with autism and ADHD in the worst case scenario. And I think there wasn't a manual. I don't think that the dad had a kind of a modern understanding of how to best parent somebody who has gone through this, if they are at that stage. And I said, no, this doesn't mean, I texted back, this doesn't mean that this is never going to happen. Repairing that trust for people who it didn't go the right way, and they didn't know how, because they didn't have that education. What would you say to the parents out there who are later in the game and may have done things that were counterproductive and not supportive because they didn't know better, and then moving forward?
So, to paraphrase Maya Angelou, do the best you can until you know better, then do better. Right. So you can't fault yourself for doing what you thought was right at the time if you can honestly say you thought that was the best thing at the time. right? One of my go-to therapy sayings is the best time to have started change was 5 years ago. The second best time is right now. If I've been waiting to go to an internist because my gut does a weird thing and I've been putting it off for 4 years, but listening to this podcast makes me go talk to somebody like you and I get diagnosed with IBS so I can get medicine for that. Yeah, my life would be better if I had done it 4 years ago. It doesn't mean I don't benefit from doing it now. And that's that holding two thoughts in your head thing. So, you know, don't treat trust like an all or nothing thing because if you did, you'll never be happy. The idea here is how can I build more trust? Just like how can I build more resilience? Now, the way to build more trust is not to do whatever your kid wants all the time. It's to set and hold appropriate boundaries and communicate openly and honestly about that stuff. I don't want you driving in this snowstorm, not because I think you're a bad driver, but because it's just not safe to drive in a snowstorm. Your kid may not like that. Your kid may not believe you, but that is best practice, right? It has not just a singular event, but a broader constellation of open, honest, clear communication, repeat. And then you look up and 3 years from now, you have built a lot more trust and you'll benefit from that for as long as you have that relationship.
And to that, I've learned a lot just in reading that Barry Prezant's Uniquely Human, try to help understand, going through Neurotribes, trying to help understand things better. Do you have any books that are a good guide for, I guess, kind of two groups? One, if you are living with this yourself, and or if you're trying to support somebody, but your brain, nobody knows how their brain works because that's the only brain they know until you work with other people and experience the world. But any books, I guess the first group is if you are having this stuff, any ones that you recommend that are a couple that are.
My colleague and friend Paula Prober wrote a book called Your Rainforest Mind. And it has spawned a sequel and then the journal, which are both exceptional. So it is really, oh, this is my brain on a plate. Thank you for understanding this, Paula. I don't know how you looked into my skull, but good for you. Another phenomenal one is How to Be Everything by Emily Wapnick. I can tell you that book changed my life. I read that book and, oh, cool. I'm allowed to put my needs first. I'm allowed to be whatever I want to be. So that is another great book. If you are in the kids space, my colleague and friend, Emily Kircher Morris have two books, Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners and Raising Twice Exceptional Children. Both of them are phenomenal.
What do you think of Neurotribes? And,
love Neurotribes. I just flew through it, right? It's
very well written. This whole story, it gets into the history, the characters involved in the development of understanding. I just find it's like a page turner.
It's really amazing. It's one it wasn't on my original list, but it just popped into my brain. Chloe Hayden's Different, Not Less. It's a very different kind of book, but I adore that book. I really enjoyed it. So Different, Not Less by Chloe Hayden. And Living Gifted, Lisa Van Gamert is another classic. We're lucky that we have a lot of great books here. I think that I'll happily share some more, right?
Sure.
In the notes, but definitely Your Rainforest Mind, The Divergent Mind by Janara Nuremberg, Living Gifted by Lisa Van Gamert, everything by Emily Kircher Morris. There's just so many good resources out there. And the best thing about it is this isn't like what to expect when you're expecting, like it's the one book, you read the one book. Like for your flavor of neurodivergence, whether it's gifted or autistic or ADHD or dyslexic or OCD or some combination thereof, there's a book and a subcommunity that exists for it. And if you punch that stuff into Google or email me or somebody like me, we'll connect you to those places, because the best thing you can do for yourself is find resources and find community. When I think fundamentally, this work always comes down to me for a quote I remember that's, when a flower's not growing, you don't blame the flower, you change the greenhouse. So understanding your brain and body is about creating your own greenhouse, and that's where you're going to do your best growing.
That's a very neurodivergent creative
Yeah.
thought.
I mean, right. It's
I
so
love that metaphor.
you-
Right. Always coming off to borrow that if your ear itches sometime. Gosh darn it, Lenz is using that
classic
greenhouse quote
land.
again. Middle of January. But all those a lot of good ideas are borrowed and shaped. You know what's interesting is the I think that the medical community, the physician community, I think is very behind this concept, especially in adults, especially in those who fall out of getting that diagnosis that is the educational diagnosis for needing that extra quote help. It seems that this is an awareness. And when you start to know what to look for, it seems like as I'm reading more, that there are a lot more people who have this that are masking and that it's causing troubles. Here's a question that I'll finish with these. This is a patient of mine who was struggling with, met her twice now, first visit, postpartum depression, and she had a sister who had severe postpartum depression that she was extremely dangerous to herself. And so when she had her child, she was having some symptoms and rightly got help and got connected and talking through things. She interestingly was diagnosed with in college with
Mhm.
ADHD. And then at age 26, when she went off her parents' insurance costs, etc., stopped taking her meds. And then now postpartum has got back on meds and had some struggles. Interestingly, in her late 20s, she worked with kids who were on the spectrum. And now I just asked the question. So we adjusted her ADHD medicine and she's doing better. But I said, hey, I'm just curious. Have you ever thought, because of social media, that you might be on the spectrum? There may be a connection with chronic. She's funny. Yeah, I've wondered about that. And then we did the CAT Q and was supporting that likely she was on the spectrum. And so we're learning about this, quote, trying to find somebody who was able to, quote, make a diagnosis. And I said, whether you have a formal diagnosis or not, that's another question. But she asked me some questions because I said I'd be talking to, and they're really good questions. So this is from a mom who has a young child, less than a year old. And she said, there is a strong genetic component in autism. With that being said, is there a correlation between the parent's autistic functionality level and their child's autistic functionality level, assuming they passed on autism on to their child? In other words, would, for lack of a better term, high functioning mother be more likely to have a high functioning child, or does autism manifest differently in everyone?
We know autism is highly heritable. We know intelligence is highly heritable. We also know that individual differences between partner and genetics and epigenetics will throw a lot of variables in there. So I wouldn't say, in my professional opinion, that one parent's neurotype would predict an offspring's neurotype. It makes them significantly more likely to be neurodivergent in some way. An example I use in this all the time is you think about Peyton Manning and Archie Manning, right? Very famous quarterbacks. Peyton Manning's a Hall of Famer. I think Eli probably will be. Archie Manning was their dad, also a Hall of Fame quarterback. Archie Manning's dad was not a quarterback, but he invented the burglar alarm, right? So they're all gifted humans, but their giftedness shifted. I worked with a young woman many years ago. This girl was, if she's the next Neil deGrasse Tyson in 20 years, it would not surprise me. She's incredible. She knew more about astrophysics as an 8-year-old than I do as well, I was 36 at the time. And her dad was like, I didn't finish high school. Where did she come from? And I'm like, you've won best auto mechanic in your county X number of years in a row. Like, I'm going to argue that you're probably gifted in terms of mechanical engineering stuff, and your kiddo's flavor of that fits a little bit better in school than yours did. You were probably not super interested in school except for shop class. He's, oh, I loved shop class. He's, but they kept making me read books in English and I didn't want to read the books. And I'm like, yeah, that's the thing. Like, it is, divergence predicts divergence, but it doesn't really predict type as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Do the benefits of therapy outweigh the possible stigma of an autism diagnosis for a child?
Absolutely. If you diagnose one of your patients with type 1 diabetes you'd tell them, right?
Hmm. Of
So they can
course.
get resources and add communities and change their diet, all those things. I cannot pretend there isn't stigma for autism, just like there's not stigma for T1D. But part of being neurodivergent affirming is saying, this is how your brain works. This is who you are. These are probably the ways it's going to impact you. Let me help you navigate that moment. And I'm going to give you the tools and the resources to do. So we cannot pretend there's not stigma, but I would rather your kid know why they spin when everybody else glides. And then we can use that to empower them and center their self in who they want to be.
And I think that's so important for the individual who's going through this, also for their family to help understand. And I would bet many people who are therapists in this world, if they aren't neurodivergent, may have had a brother or sister who was, and they had a deep heart out of that to help the world care for them better. And we talked about this question. There are so many resources. Seems like a lot of resources for kids. If there is an adult who may be newly diagnosed, again, I know you talked about online support. Any other thoughts as somebody who raised this question on how to process that as an adult, especially if they've never really sat on it
Yeah.
very long up until a new
Yeah.
diagnosis?
I mean, there are a lot of Facebook communities that you can start at. Mensa has meetup groups. The Actually Autistic movement, there's a lot of stuff in that space. The Octopus, was it the Octopus Society, the Octopus Movement? Some of the Octopus. I think it's the Octopus Movement. The idea there is that it's never too late. And we want you to be a part of those communities. We want you to have a seat at that table. So we don't try to gatekeep these things. I always say, if you have privilege, you build a bigger table, not a higher fence. And you may not be comfortable going to a Mensa meeting, right? But if you love Dungeons and Dragons and that scratches your itch and you can find a meetup to do Dungeons and Dragons, you are, for all intents and purposes, going to a neurodivergent meetup. They may not know it, but I would bet you a steak dinner. That's what's happening. Start with interests, and interests build connections, which build community, which will likely branch into other communities. One of my colleagues started in the gifted world when her kid got into chess, which got him into LARPing, live action role play, if you don't know, which got him into archery, which got him into physics because archery is physics. And they realized he's really great at STEM. And then she made it all the way back to gifted because the really good STEM school is a gifted school. And she goes, oh my gosh, my kid's been a gifted kid the whole time. And so she's that's my journey, that I had to walk all the way around the block to get back to my house. Right. But sometimes that's what it takes. So, it doesn't matter where you start as long as you start.
Yeah, starting that journey. And hopefully for people who are listening to this podcast, many who I did a survey on one of the Facebook fibromyalgia groups, and I asked a simple question with 3 choices. I said, how many of you think that you have a neurodivergent type brain? And the choices were yes, probably, I'm not sure, but likely, and I'm pretty sure not. And about a third said, I'm pretty sure yes. A third said, might have, but I'm not sure. And a third said no. So I think there's a lot of overlap in the fibromyalgia world that many people don't even know how that impacts potentially some of the other struggles that are going on. And this overlaps, as you're probably knowing, with a lot of these physical things that people have and we're learning. And that's that intersection here with the autism world and these medical conditions. And a lot of people don't even know these are co-occurring, and a lot of the silos are occurring. As a doctor, I try to stand at the intersection of all of this. And I mentioned this and I said, I'm learning a lot more about this over this summer, but I was talking about this as I'm learning, and I talked to him and he said, we haven't told him yet that he's on the spectrum. I'm like, what? And so I think there still is a stigma out there. And I think it comes from misunderstanding. I guess it's good to have that part of the conversation, because not knowing and yet going to a person, and that's where trying to find somebody and having those resources, like you said, online. The other thing is, last thing, that this is for more of a personal thing, I switched to a new health system for the medical college system. And part of the reason was I take care of
Mhm.
neurodivergent people. When I talk about these other overlapping conditions, not a lot of people do that in the traditional medical community. So I accumulate, as one of my patients said to me, who's neurodivergent, who interestingly, when you start seeing families, is she has ADHD, her son has ADHD, her husband's the mechanic who's a brain who never went past high school, who's just like the astrophysics dad, who's super smart, but he's the coworkers just put the tools on the mat and I'll put them in my tool chest because I just have a certain way. The daughter now sees me, who also is on the spectrum. But anyways, this mom had said to me, "Boy, you sure taking care of us people who live on the island of
Yeah.
misfit toys." And sometimes it can feel like that. And hopefully, what I'm doing in my small role can help so that this ends up with the next generation of physicians and for physicians who are neutral to be, oh, once you recognize that may be part of it, and it's as I'm starting to being aware of this and then asking some simple screening questions, like all of a sudden the air
Yeah.
comes out. And this is just that acceptance that the doctor understands somebody like me. I jokingly like to say you're not that special because I take care of a lot of people who have similar kinds of things, even though everybody's got their own unique issues with things. And then, but anyways, any last thoughts that you have on this as we wrap?
Anytime I do a podcast like this, there's no way that we can cover everything. It's too big a topic. It's a giant thing. But hopefully this gave you some threads to pull. And the work starts now. And you might be beating yourself up for not starting it sooner, but it doesn't matter. All you can do is start right now. And you can start where you're at. And you will find that the more you understand about your brain and your neurodivergence, the more full and authentic your life will be. And that's what I want for you. And that's what Dr. Lenz wants for you. And that's what your loved ones want for you. And give yourself permission to put yourself first. And if that's through neurodivergence, then welcome to the club.
Us, thanks again so much
It
for
was a
being here.
blast. Thanks for
Let
having
me
me.
just